There are stories that people tell each other to tickle their nerves, but there are also some that it would be better not to know about. What happened to me changed my idea of fear forever. This is a story that I couldn't talk about for a long time, but now I think it's time to tell the truth. It happened a few years ago. I was 25 at the time, and I was just going through a difficult period in my life. Deciding to take my mind off it, I went to visit an old friend whom I hadn't seen for several years. He lived in a small town on the edge of the forest where my childhood used to be. This place has always caused me mixed feelings, at the same time nostalgia and something like anxiety, but then I did not attach any importance to it. When I arrived there, I quickly noticed that the town had changed a lot. People became gloomy, as if something oppressed them. Even old acquaintances I met on the street avoided eye contact and tried to end the conversation as quickly as possible. Everything seemed somehow wrong, but I put it down to time and the difficulties of life. My friend, let's call him Alex, greeted me cordially, but even he looked tired and exhausted. On the first night, sitting in the kitchen over a cup of tea, he told me about what had been happening here in recent years. It turned out that many residents began to leave the town, and those who stayed lived in constant fear. Alex talked about strange disappearances, about how people just disappeared and no one knew what happened to them. It was said that somewhere in the forest there was a place where it was better not to go, especially at night. But no one knew exactly what place it was about. On the second day of my arrival, Alex suggested that I go to the lake, where we often spent time as children. He thought it would help to take his mind off dark thoughts and bring back his former joy. I agreed, but something inside me told me that this was not the best idea. When we arrived at the lake, it looked the same as before. Quiet, calm, surrounded by dense forest. But as soon as we entered the forest to walk around the lake along the path, I felt something strange. The feeling that someone was watching us did not leave me. Alex also became silent and tense, although he tried to hide it. We were halfway there when we noticed something strange on the ground, several fresh tracks that led deeper into the forest. These footprints were human, but for some reason they inspired me with an unconscious horror. Alex looked at me, and in his eyes I saw the same feeling that I felt myself. "We'd better get back," he finally said, but his voice was shaking. We turned back, but as soon as we did, we heard the crunching of branches behind us. We stopped and turned around, but we didn't see anyone. With each step, the noise grew louder, as if someone or something was moving behind us in the shade of the trees. We walked faster. Fear paralyzed us. Alex, who had always been calm and confident, began to panic. We were almost running when we finally saw the car, but when it was only a few meters away, Alex suddenly stopped. "Look," he whispered, pointing to something ahead. In the darkness of the forest, a little further from the car, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. An old, torn poster with a photo of a man who disappeared several years ago hung on the trunk of a tree. But the scariest thing was that this poster was not faded or ruined by time. He looked like he had been hanged just a couple of days ago. When we stood in front of that ominous poster, time seemed to stop. His heart was pounding so hard that it seemed to resound throughout the forest. Alex was pale as death, and his hand, pointing at the poster, was shaking. It seemed to me that I had forgotten how to breathe from fear. "It's impossible," Alex said in a barely audible voice. "This man disappeared many years ago." Finally, we forced ourselves to move on. Alex and I quickly crossed the few meters separating us from the car and climbed inside with relief. Almost in desperation, I started the engine, and we took off down a country road away from the lake, away from the forest, which we swore not to return to. But the worst was just beginning. On the way back, we noticed that it was already getting dark, although we should have returned before dark. The road suddenly seemed endless to us. We drove and drove. Everything around us remained the same, as if we were moving in a circle. Alex was nervously looking in the rearview mirror, and then suddenly turned even paler and grabbed my hand. "Stop the car." "Stop it," he shouted. "There's someone in the back." I slammed on the brake. There was no time to think at that moment. I just followed his instruction. We both turned slowly to look back. What we saw will always remain in my nightmares. There was a figure sitting in the back seat, where no one should have been. It was a man, or what it once was. His skin was deathly pale, almost blue, and his eyes were wide open and empty. A disgusting smell of rot came from his body, mixed with something sour, which immediately caused a gag reflex in his throat. This dead man was the man from the poster, only there was nothing human in his eyes. They were filled with hatred and pain, as if he was living in eternal agony. I grabbed the door handle, trying to jump out of the car, but the figure suddenly moved. Her hand, with bones barely covered by rotting flesh, reached out to Alex as if to grab him by the throat. Alex screamed, jerked back, and at that moment, I managed to open the door and jump out. But I couldn't just leave him. I quickly walked around the car and opened his door. Alex got out, stumbling, and we both ran into the woods, not even thinking about what might be waiting for us there. We ran like never before in our lives, not looking back, not taking apart the road. Branches whipped at our faces, tearing our skin, but fear drove us forward, not letting us stop. Finally, when our strength was almost gone, we fell to the ground in some old ravine, gasping for air. Something rustled in the darkness, but it was no longer up to that. We were sure that the dead man could not have followed us, but an even greater horror awaited us. When we came to our senses a little, Alex raised his head and froze. Right in front of us, on the other side of the ravine, was a pit covered with old planks. The boards looked like they'd been thrown hastily to hide something. The fetid smell of decomposition emanated from the pit. Alex, almost unaware of what he was doing, walked to the edge and slowly lifted one of the boards. In the darkness of the ravine, illuminated by the dim light of the moon, I saw him suddenly freeze, looking into the pit. At first he didn't say anything, and then he whispered softly, "Damn it, it can't be true." I came closer and looked inside. There were bodies in the pit. Many bodies. They were piled on top of each other like puppets dropped after a performance. Some of them were in such a state that it was impossible to determine how long they had been there. But the horror was different. Some of them still had scraps of clothing in which I recognized those who had disappeared in this city in recent years. But that wasn't all. I didn't want to believe my eyes. But one of the bodies was fresh, very fresh. It was John, the guy who disappeared from a nearby town a few weeks ago. I read about his disappearance on the news and could not even imagine that I would find him here in this forest. But the scariest thing was that his face was frozen in an expression of absolute horror, as if in the last minutes of his life he had seen something terrible that defied human understanding. At that moment, I felt something touch my leg. I turned around and saw that a hand was reaching out from the pit, between the boards. It was unnaturally long and thin, with black claws that tried to grab onto my leg. I jumped back and shouted at Alex to run away. We ran blindly, stumbling and falling over and over again. But fear drove us on. We didn't know where to go, but we knew one thing for sure. We couldn't go back to the car. We raced into the unknown, until finally we ran out onto an old abandoned road, where, like a miracle, a passing truck picked us up. To this day, I cannot explain what happened then. Those bodies, the dead man in the car, the hand from the pit, all this remains with me as a terrible reminder that there are things that are better left alone. Alex never mentioned that forest again, and I tried to forget it too. Every night when I close my eyes, I see that pit and the bodies frozen in horror. We drove in complete silence, breathing heavily and not even daring to look at each other. Trucks seemed to move endlessly, but I didn't pay attention to it. We were too shocked, too scared to realize that the road we were driving on did not exist on the map. Alex was looking out the window, his gaze blank and detached, as if his soul was still in that damn forest. When we finally got to the city, the driver didn't say anything. He just opened the door for us and nodded towards the road. Alex and I climbed out, still trembling with fear. And only then did we notice that the truck had disappeared, as suddenly as it had appeared. The next day I left this town and never returned there. Alex and I didn't discuss what happened anymore. He soon sold the house and also went somewhere far away, trying to forget. We've lost touch, and sometimes I think it's for the best. Even a casual reminder of this evening makes my hands shake and my heart freeze with horror. Several years have passed. That forest, that pit, and those bodies remain in my memory like an indelible scar. There are nights when I wake up in a cold sweat, remembering the face of that dead man in the car or the feeling of someone's hand reaching out to me from the darkness. I tried to forget, tried to convince myself that it was just a nightmare, a figment of my sick imagination. Too many things indicate that it was real.